The first thing June Joe Mallory noticed about Ash Hollow, Wyoming, in the summer of 1887, wasn't the smell of pine or wet earth. It was the scent of dry, restless failure. It smelled like iron and overbaked dust, a fine, acrid powder that coated everything. Joe pulled the brim of her old felt hat low, shielding her eyes from the raw, open sky. The sky here was too big, stretched thin like a worn piece of blue canvas over a land too vast for human intention. She had ridden hard for 3 days from the Kansas border, following the rail lines that were, even now, aggressively biting their way into the high plains. Ash Hollow wasn't much of a town, a single dusty street flanked by a weathered general store, a saloon with too many dark windows, and a squat wooden building advertising Pearl's Board and Victuals. The surrounding landscape rolled away in gray. Wind-beaten slopes, covered in sparse, thirsty grass. This was high desert country, and the drought had chewed the color out of everything. The wind itself was perpetually dry, carrying that omnipresent red dust that settled on her oilskin coat and stung her lips. It was the color of dried blood and uncertainty. Joe was 26, and the past 2 years had been nothing but a determined ride away from a past she'd rather forget back in eastern Kansas. She carried little baggage, but what she did carry was heavy a certain hard practicality, a talent for riding that bordered on reckless, and a competency with a revolver that she hoped she wouldn't have to prove. Her short-term goal was simple: find a job, find a room, and find a measure of safety where she could finally rest her bones. Her long-term goal was harder to build a life that was honest, quiet, and belonged entirely to her. She swung down from her weary sorrel mare. Tempest, Joe moved with a disciplined economy of motion, the kind born of living outdoors and having no one to rely on but your own 2 feet. She was slender, but built for endurance, and the denim and leather she wore blended in with the background. She scanned the street. The mood was low. Men stood leaning against posts, not talking much, their gazes fixed on the horizon, where the heat mirages shimmered like false promises of water. There were fewer cattle than she expected for a ranching town, and the ones she saw looked gaunt. The railroad expansion wasn't bringing prosperity. It seemed to be sucking the very moisture out of the air. The underlying tension here was as thick as the dust. It was the clash between the small homesteaders and the behemoth known as Kincaid Cattle and Rail, Silas Kincaid. Joe had heard rumors filtering up the trail. Was the local face of that encroaching economic power. She tied Tempest to a hitching rail outside Pearl's. The building was the only one that looked moderately cared for, boasting a chipped but legible sign and a wisp of smoke struggling out of the kitchen chimney. Inside, the light was dim and cool. Joe let her eyes adjust, smelling coffee, old grease, and something faintly medicinal. Behind the counter stood a stout woman in a clean apron, Mrs. Peril, whose eyes missed nothing and whose face suggested she had heard every excuse in the West and believed none of them. "Coffee?" Pearl asked, her voice low and surprisingly musical. "Just water, if it ain't too much trouble," Joe said. She took off her hat, letting the dry air hit her forehead. Pearl glanced at the gun belt Joe wore, then back at her face. "Water's a commodity here, honey, but you look like you earned the last of it. Sit down." As Joe sat at a small, scarred table, she noticed the water situation was worse than she thought. A dry well and a few drooping cattails by a creek bed were the town's established symbols of hope slowly fading away. Signs that were subtly pointing toward the central theme: justice before economic oppression, and family as a deliberate choice. "You passed through the ranch lands?" Pearl asked, setting a glass of surprisingly cool, clean water in front of Joe. "Came up the freight line. Saw a lot of scrub and dry creek beds," Joe replied, taking a slow, appreciative drink. "Looks like the drought's been biting hard." "Drought's one thing. Man's greed is another," Pearl murmured, wiping the counter with unnecessary vigor. "Silas Kincaid holds the deeds to half the new rail track in most of the Upper Valley. Been buying up water rights cheap." or just letting the little guys dry out until they sell. Joe had seen men like Kincaid before, smiling coldly while their lawyers drafted papers that stole a man's future. Kincaid wanted to buy cheap, corner the water supply, and consolidate all the fertile land under his railroad umbrella. "Any honest work going?" Joe asked, her voice deliberately neutral. Pearl laughed. A short, realistic sound. "Honest, well, if you call breaking your back for $1 a day honest, the men here are holding on to what they have. Nobody's hiring extra hands unless they're working for Kincaid, building fences that keep neighbors out, not cattle in." Joe leaned back, observing the room. She noticed the local community, mostly small farmers and townspeople trying to make a living. The town blacksmith, Hobbs, a massive man who seemed caught between the need for Kincaid's rail contracts and his loyalty to the homesteaders, was sitting in the corner, nursing a single beer and looking troubled. Then there was the town's only law enforcement, Deputy Bale, a thin, nervous man with a badge that looked too shiny for his responsibilities. He walked in, nodding curtly to Pearl and ignoring Hobbs. Bale's boots were too clean for this dusty town. He reeked of Kincaid's loyalty, the kind that was bought with greenbacks, not respect. Joe gave Bale a brief, clinical assessment, storing away the fact that his eyes darted nervously, indicating a man under pressure, likely working two masters poorly. The conversation turned to the local small rancher, Eli Cutter. "Poor Eli Cutter," Pearl sighed. "That boy's got the hardest fight, trying to keep his ranch and his late cousin's girl, Mabel, fed. Lost his cousin in a mine accident last year. Eli's good people, but he's quiet and stubborn. Got a small spread and a few dozen horses, good stock, but the water's low. Horses are harder to sell than cattle in this market," Joe commented. "Exactly. Kincaid knows that. He's squeezing Eli, offering a pittance, saying the land's worthless without the creek water." Joe listened, tracing the rim of her glass with a thumb. She understood the weight of responsibility, the need to keep a roof over a child's head, the silent battle to maintain honor against overwhelming economic force. A voice cut through the room, gentle but firm. "Good morning, Mrs. Pearl. Good morning, all." It was Pastor Reeves, a kind-faced man in dusty black clothes. He seemed genuinely decent, but there was a hesitant quality to his movements, the physical manifestation of fear of the town's new, unofficial power structure. He greeted everyone except Deputy Bale, avoiding any potential conflict that might arise from associating with Kincaid's hired hand. This was the texture of Ash Hollow, a place where goodness existed but was constantly forced to bow its head before the cold smile of money. Joe stood up, leaving a coin on the table. "Thank you for the water, Mrs. Pearl. I appreciate the hospitality." "You looking for a place to stay?" Pearl asked, her eyes searching Joe's face, assessing her reliability. "If you have a dry corner," Joe said. "I'm good with horses, good with a needle and thread, and I can mend a basic fence. I don't ask many questions, and I don't offer many answers." Pearl nodded slowly. "That's about the best kind of neighbor in this town. See Hobbs outside. Maybe he knows someone who needs a hand. But keep your eyes open. Joe, this town's full of shadows." Joe stepped back into the heat. The red dust immediately clung to her coat again, a fine layer of instability reminding her of her own precarious position. As she walked toward the general store, she felt the familiar, private weight beneath her thin shirt. Tucked into an oilskin pouch and sewn into the lining of her vest were two crucial items. The first was an old land registry document, thin and brittle, detailing a parcel of land marked by an archaic survey, now likely superseded by the railroad's claims. The second was a rough, faded sketch, marked only with the words, "Coyote Spring," detailing a secret aquifer or rock fissure that, according to the notes, had once fed the upper creek near Ash Hollow. The sketch and the deed were tied to a name she barely remembered: a woman, a washerwoman, someone poor and easily cheated out of her small stake in the world decades ago. Joe had no idea if the documents were still legally sound or if the spring still held water. It was merely a ghost, a seed of a twist, a fragile hope that if she could trace the spring's location, she might find an honest way to settle her own past. It was a secret she wasn't yet ready to share, not even with a generous woman like Pearl. She needed to find work. She needed a place to hide and watch. And she needed to figure out if Ash Hollow was going to be the place where she finally built that honest life, or just another stop on a long, dusty road. The core conflict of the land, the battle for water rights, the struggle of the small farmers against the monolithic Kincaid, was the framework. Joe was merely walking into the scene, a weary traveler looking for shelter, yet unknowingly carrying the forgotten map to the region's greatest asset, a piece of knowledge that could either save Ash Hollow or drown her in its escalating conflict. As she tightened Tempest's saddle cinches, preparing to explore the dusty outskirts, Joe glanced at the wide, barren stretch of land just past the town's edge Eli Cutter's property. She inhaled the dry, coppery air, smelling the grit and the challenge. Blink, and you might miss the chance to start over. She thought, this red dust is my exposition now. Joe hadn't found Hobbs, but she had found the livery, a wide, drafty barn on the edge of town, closer to the dry, skeletal creek bed than to the saloon. She was tightening Tempest's feed bag when the sound of gunfire, sharp and too close, ripped the stillness of the afternoon. It wasn't the distant, echoing sound of a hunter's rifle. It was the rapid, uneven bark of a confrontation, a stagecoach ambush. Judging by the rhythm, instinct took over. Joe didn't hesitate. She tossed the feed bag, checked the chambers of her revolver, and vaulted onto Tempest. She urged the mare toward the sound, a shallow depression beyond the last cluster of cottonwoods. The red dust boiled behind them. She arrived just as the action was peaking. A small, heavily built mail and passenger wagon was canted hard against a rise. 3 men, heavily armed and wearing scarves over their faces, were drawing down on the driver and a frightened passenger. Joe reined in behind a cluster of boulders 50 yards back, quickly assessing the situation. 3 men on horseback. One had a shotgun pointed at the driver. The other 2 were covering the passenger's side. And there was a young girl, maybe 13 years old, hiding clumsily behind a stack of mail bags in the open back of the wagon, her eyes wide with terror, frozen in place. That must be Mabel, Eli Cutter's cousin. Joe realized. The bandits were focused on the front. Joe didn't wait for the situation to escalate. She drew her revolver, its weight familiar and steady in her hand. She needed to disrupt their formation without causing unnecessary bloodshed. They were robbers, not soldiers. The leader, a burly man with a distinctive, low-slung hunting rifle, was already shouting. Joe sighted on the rear wheel of his horse a precise shot that would cripple the animal's mobility without killing it outright. She breathed out slowly. Crack! The sound of Joe's shot was unexpectedly loud in the open air. The bullet didn't hit the horse, but instead struck the wooden spokes of the bandit leader's saddle wheel, splintering the wood and making the horse rear in confusion. The leader cursed, turning his attention to the new threat. We got company, take care of the pest. The sound of Joe's shot had startled the driver, who used the distraction to drop the shotgun he'd been holding onto and dive for cover. The 2 remaining bandits pivoted, spraying disorganized fire toward Joe's position. Joe dropped flat behind the boulder, the dirt spitting around her. She risked a glance. Mabel was still huddled in the wagon, but she was now moving, crawling further into the shadows of the carriage. This was not a long-term fight Joe wanted. She wanted to scare them off, fast. She fired a quick succession of 3 shots. One hit the ground dangerously close to the nearest bandit's boot, kicking up a plume of dirt and rock fragments. The second shot clipped the rim of the lead bandit's hat. The third went high, a deliberate warning, echoing off the bluff. The bandits realized they were facing an unseen, calm opponent who was willing to engage. They hadn't expected the passenger wagon to be defended by a marksman hidden in the scrub. They exchanged panicked shouts. Just then, a wave of dust erupted from the north ridge. A powerful, dark bay horse and rider burst over the hill, moving with furious speed. It was Eli Cutter. He had heard the distant gunfire from his ranch and ridden out to investigate. Eli didn't stop to assess. He was moving too fast for caution. He fired 2 shots from his saddle, a hunting rifle leveled expertly. The shots were aimed not at the men, but at the ground right next to their horses. Caught between Joe's steady, precise fire from the south and Eli's aggressive, unexpected arrival from the north, the bandits panicked. Their focus shifted from the mailbags to immediate retreat. "Let's go, it ain't worth this," the leader yelled, his voice rough. They spurred their horses and retreated into the rough territory. As they vanished, Joe noticed something odd. One of the bandits had stumbled on the recently churned earth near the small, dry creek bed, the only spot where a little moisture persisted, fed by a meager, hidden seep. His footprints, briefly visible as he remounted, were deep, wide boot prints, the kind made by well-fed, well-shod ranch hands who spent more time in the soft ground of irrigated land than on the open, dry range. They were not the boots of typical, starving road agents. They suggested an employer with resources, perhaps someone like Kincaid. Joe rose slowly, her heart pounding a quick, clean rhythm. She approached the wagon, her gun still ready. The scene was a tableau of dust and shock. The driver was rubbing his head, looking grateful but bewildered. Mabel, the girl, was scrambling out of the mailbags, tears streaking clean lines through the red dust on her face. Then Joe and Eli met. Eli Cutter, 32, was built like a man who worked the earth, solid and unhurried even when moving fast. His features were sharp, his eyes a cold, clear blue, now narrowed with suspicion. He looked first at the shotgun pellet wounds on the side of the wagon, then at Joe. His gaze lingered on her gun belt, her dusty, practical clothes, and the steady, unblinking intensity in her eyes. It was a look that mixed deep suspicion with reluctant respect. "You saved the stage," Eli said, his voice low, a slow, gravelly sound. It was not a thank you, it was a simple statement of fact, a question disguised as an observation. "They were sloppy," Joe countered, holstering her weapon. "They wanted the mail, not a fight. They just needed a good fright." Mabel ran past the still wary Eli, throwing herself at Joe. "You're the bravest lady you just shot and shot. Were you a soldier?" Joe flinched slightly at the word lady. "I'm no soldier, kid. Just practical." Eli gently pulled Mabel back, his hand protective on her shoulder. The first glance of alliance, born in shared action, was instantly undercut by Eli's instinct to shield his young cousin from the armed stranger. He was weighing her courage against her recklessness. "We need to get to town," Eli said, his eyes still holding Joe's. The connection was one of mutual, armed caution. They had fought together, but they were still strangers standing on opposing sides of a silent, invisible line. The ride back was slow. Joe's old coat, now dusted with a mixture of red earth and a few spots of the driver's blood, made her look even more like a gunslinger and less like a woman just passing through. The dust of the ambush clung to her, a volatile symbol of the danger she had faced and the suspicion she now attracted. She had saved a life, but she was now marked by the violence she had employed. They had barely entered Ash Hollow when Deputy Bale, alerted by the anxious driver, intercepted them. Bale, smelling a chance to impress his masters, immediately focused his authority on the wrong target. "Who are you?" Bale demanded, his hand hovering over his sidearm. "And why were you discharging a firearm within the jurisdiction?" Joe felt a familiar, cold wave of resentment. She hated the way authority, particularly corrupt authority, always focused on the easiest target. "I was defending the United States mail and a minor passenger from armed robbery," Joe stated flatly. "We'll see about that," Bale said, stepping closer. "Seems mighty convenient for a stranger just riding in to be exactly where the trouble starts. I'll need you to surrender your weapon and submit to questioning." Bale was pressing too hard, too fast. Jo kept her hands in the clear, but her eyes held a steady, dangerous light. She was about to offer a few well-chosen, cutting words about the deputy's general incompetence when Eli Cutter stepped forward, placing himself squarely between Jo and Bale. Eli was a man who rarely spoke, but when he did, the words carried the weight of the land itself. "Deputy Bale," Eli said, his voice quiet but commanding. "The 3 men who tried to rob the stage got away. They were armed, and they would have hurt Mabel. Miss Mallory saved the girl in the mail. She is a witness, not a suspect. She saved a member of my family." Eli's intervention was swift and definitive. It established an immediate, albeit temporary, alliance. He wasn't vouching for Jo's past, but for her present actions. "She saved my person." Eli's gaze communicated to the deputy. Bale, who worked for Kincaid, rarely crossed a homesteader unless he had Kincaid's direct order. Eli Cutter, stubborn as he was, still commanded a certain quiet respect among the men of the community. Bale hesitated, the power draining from his face. "Well, you come to the office later, Miss," Bale muttered, backing down. "I'll be waiting." Eli turned to Jo, giving her a single, sharp nod of recognition. It was the deepest compliment he could give. "Come to my ranch," he offered, the words tight and practical. "I need an extra hand with the horses this season. I can offer room and board, and some rations. We can talk about wages later, when things settle." It was a proposition born of necessity, not desire. Eli was desperate for help, and Jo had just proved she was both capable and deadly, a valuable combination in this climate. It also offered Jo exactly what she needed: work, a safe roof, and a place quiet enough to look into her past, specifically the old map hidden in her vest. "I accept," Jo replied immediately, "but I'll need to settle my horse at Pearl's." Pearl, having heard the commotion and the subsequent showdown, immediately took Jo aside. "I'll give you my small room above the kitchen. Cheap," Pearl whispered, pressing a small flask into Jo's hand. "It's near the back stairs, easy to slip out if you need to. That Bale has a nose for trouble, and trouble is always following Kincaid's orders." Jo accepted the offer for the room, but the temporary arrangement at Eli's ranch quickly established itself as the center of her new life. Mabel, who had been clinging to Eli's shadow, now looked at Jo with a mixture of awe and sharp curiosity. "You shot their wheel clean off," Mabel breathed, her eyes shining. "How did you learn to shoot like that? Where are you from? My cousin says strangers are usually trouble." Mabel's questions were blunt, and her admiration for Jo's skill was palpable. Yet it was laced with the natural caution of a girl who had already lost too much. Mabel's scrutiny was the town's scrutiny, and Jo knew she was being tested. Jo offered a small, sincere smile. "I learned to aim straight at what I wanted to hit, and mostly to keep my head low. And your cousin is right. Strangers are usually trouble, but sometimes they're just desperate for a place to start over." Jo had revealed a piece of her motivation: the raw need for money and, more critically, a secure roof over her head. A place quiet enough where she could unpack the heavy baggage of her past and finally decide what kind of future she could honestly claim. She was tired of running and needed ground to stand on. The town's initial reaction was already turning toxic. As Jo walked back to Pearl's, she heard the low, ugly whispers. "A girl with a gun. No, lady, that one." The community's rigid expectation of femininity, a gentle, powerless creature, clashed violently with the capable, armed woman who had just saved one of their children. The badge of courage quickly became a mark of suspicion. That evening, as Jo washed the dust and the blood spots from her coat, the red dust blending with the darker, metallic stain of the driver's injury, she felt the symbolic weight of the garment. It was a coat that represented both the saving of a life and the social stigma of being too capable, too aggressive, too unwomanly. She was simultaneously a rescuer and an outsider. The hook that sealed Joe's fate to Ash Hollow arrived late that night. Eli Cutter was sitting alone on his porch, a pipe unlit in his hand, when a clean, black carriage rolled up his dusty lane. Out stepped a sleek lawyer, carrying a polished leather satchel and an air of detached superiority. The lawyer handed Eli a folded document. It was a formal ultimatum from Silas Kincaid, the head of Kincaid Cattle and Rail. The note was polite, cold, and final. It offered Eli a non-negotiable price for his ranch and demanded a signed sales contract within 10 days. The explicit threat was not written, but understood: sell out, or the creek that fed your small reservoir will run dry completely, and your land will become worthless dust before the summer ends. Eli crumpled the paper in his fist, the sound like the dry grass of his own dying fields. He looked up at the moon, which seemed to mock his plight, hanging full and bright over the dry land he had sworn to keep. The fight had been brought to his doorstep, and now he had an armed stranger. Joe Mallory, sleeping in his spare room, an unstable alliance, forged in the dust and fire of an ambush, was about to be severely tested by the relentless pressure of Kincaid's greed. Eli knew, with a certainty that chilled him, that the fight for water was not just about the land anymore. It was about survival, for himself and for Mabel, and he was now dragging Joe into his war. The rhythm of Eli Cutter's small ranch was one of quiet, disciplined endurance, and Joe fell into it with the ease of someone who understood hard work was simply survival in disguise. Her days now had purpose beyond running. She was earning her keep. Each morning, before the sun had fully burned the copper haze out of the sky, Joe was in the small, dusty corral. She moved among Eli's horses, a herd of sturdy, obstinate animals that seemed to regard the drought as a personal insult. Her job was to lead them out to the farthest, least grazed patches of scrub, a daily negotiation between the horses' stubbornness and the necessity of finding feed. She was patient but firm, guiding them without a fuss, recognizing the kinship between herself and creatures born to the wild, yet confined by circumstance. Eli watched her work once, a long, silent appraisal, and simply nodded. No praise was necessary. Competence was its own language here. The afternoons were spent in the relentless, back-breaking work of digging. Eli was desperately trying to capture the meager subsurface flow of the nearly dry creek that ran through his property. They worked side by side in the baking heat, deepening the irrigation ditch and reinforcing the banks with dry, sun-baked clay. The ground was hard, resistant, and laced with the fine, choking red dust. If the creek was running right, this ditch wouldn't need digging past ankle depth, Eli observed one afternoon, leaning on his shovel. "It ain't just the drought, is it?" Joe asked, wiping the sweat from her brow with the back of a mud-caked hand. Eli shook his head, his eyes narrowed, looking upstream toward the rougher, wooded section bordering the Kincaid holdings. "There's a natural seep where the creek crosses my northern line. The old-timers called it the Coyote Trace. It hasn't fully dried out even in the worst years, but this year, it's nothing but a trickle. Feels wrong. Feels like something's been rerouted, or blocked." Joe's mind clicked immediately, connecting the dry, blocked creek to the hidden map she carried. The Coyote Trace. It was the same name. She kept her expression blank. However, she needed proof before she exposed her fragile hand. In the evenings, after the labor, Joe turned her attention to Mabel. The girl had been neglected since her father's death, her schooling abandoned. Joe, using a charcoal pencil and scraps of brown paper, began teaching Mabel to write her letters, starting with the hard, sharp shapes of the alphabet. Mabel was a quick study, fueled by her hero worship of Joe's audacity and her desperate need for stability. "You write clean." "Joe," Mabel said one night, watching Joe write a list of farm chores, "did you go to a fancy school?" "Not fancy, just necessary," Joe replied. "If you can write, Nobody can tell you what your deed says. You can tell them. The subtle lesson was clear. Literacy was a weapon and a defense in a world ruled by men with written contracts. The atmosphere in Eli's small farmhouse, while frugal, began to warm. The kitchen was always clean, the stew simple but nourishing. Jo found herself relaxing in the quiet domesticity, the sound of the kerosene lamp hissing. Mabel's low, concentrated breathing as she worked on her letters, and Eli's heavy but contented silence as he mended tack. It felt, startlingly, like home. Jo, who carried the deep-seated shame of her past, the sense of being forever outside the pale of respectability, was surprised to find comfort in this honest, struggling home. The fragile peace was tested when Eli and Jo rode into town for supplies. They encountered Silas Kincaid in the middle of the dusty main street. Kincaid, dressed in clean, pressed gray wool, looked out of place among the ragged farmers. He was smiling, but the smile never reached his cold, appraising eyes. "Mr. Cutter." Kincaid greeted him smoothly, extending a perfectly gloved hand. Eli ignored the hand, nodding curtly. Kincaid then turned his attention to Jo, allowing his gaze to sweep over her work clothes and the obvious strength in her shoulders. "And this must be the spirited lady who saved the stagecoach. You have my thanks. A beautiful act of courage. I was just doing my job." "Mr. Jo returned, keeping her tone flat. She hated the falseness in his voice and the calculated way he called her lady. Kincaid chuckled, a sound like dry leaves rustling. "But you shouldn't have to do such work. Miss Mallory, a woman of your obvious capabilities. You are far from safety out here. The West is a dangerous place for a woman traveling alone, especially one who attracts this kind of notoriety." He gestured subtly toward her holstered revolver. The implication was clear. "You have a reputation. You need a protector. I can offer you safety if you convince Cutter to sell." He was gently, menacingly, trying to place her into a category of vulnerable woman and suggesting she should seek the protection that his wealth offered. Jo felt the hackles rise. That was her deep internal conflict, the shame of being deemed unladylike, unrespectable, combined with her fierce rejection of anyone trying to define her place. "I prefer a little danger to feeling too safe." "Sir," Jo replied, looking him straight in the eye. "It keeps you awake." Eli watched the exchange, his jaw tight. He recognized the predatory game Kincaid was playing not just with Jo, but with everyone he sought to dispossess. Kincaid simply smiled wider, a truly frigid expression. "Well, I wish you both luck, but luck runs dry faster than water out here." He tipped his hat and walked away, his well-polished boots kicking up Ash Hollow's eternal red dust. The encounter left a sour taste, but the social conflict was about to deepen dramatically. That evening, the town council convened at the small, rough courthouse. The vote was called on a matter Kincaid had subtly orchestrated, the temporary diversion of water rights. Kincaid's representative argued that diverting the Upper Creek's remaining flow via a newly built channel, a channel that conveniently bypassed small ranches like Eli's, was a necessity. It was, the representative claimed, for the common good, ensuring enough water for the main railroad depot and the town's growing population, the population Kincaid was importing to work the rail lines. The small homesteaders argued passionately, but the votes were stacked against them. Deputy Bale and several merchants beholden to Kincaid's credit voted in favor. The motion passed. Kincaid had legally, if temporarily, condemned the small farmers to dry wells. Eli took the news with a grim stoicism that barely masked his inner turmoil. He was biting down hard on his debt and his determination. His father's old words, often repeated during difficult harvests, echoed in his memory. "A man who keeps his water keeps his home. Lose the water, you lose everything." Eli saw this as a matter of personal honor and a sacred duty to Mabel. He had to keep this land for her, even if it meant fighting a losing battle against the railroad's endless money. Jo watched Eli struggle, their relationship, born of the dust and the shovel, began to deepen with small, unnoticed acts of shared effort. One evening, Joe found a tear in Eli's heavy denim shirt, a tear he had roughly stitched himself with clumsy threads. Joe took the shirt and mended it perfectly with tight, invisible stitches. "You so neat," Eli noted later, looking down at the mended fabric. "Necessary. Remember Joe said?" Another time, Joe was struggling to explain to Mabel why sometimes the kindest people don't always win the fights. Eli intervened, not with grand philosophy, but with practical, Western wisdom. "The problem with talk is it's cheap," Eli said, not looking up from sanding a bridle. "Noise don't move mountains. Joe, show her how you hold your rifle when you shoot. Steady. You talk too much. You miss the mark. You learn to speak little but speak true, and your words hit harder." He wasn't teaching her grammar. He was teaching her sincerity and impact. Joe found herself absorbing his quiet lessons. Say less. Aim true. These small moments, the shared meal where Mabel's laughter was the only bright sound. Joe's steady hands mending Eli's clothes. Eli's quiet wisdom teaching Joe a new kind of restraint were the warm center of a world rapidly turning cold. The good news was fading fast. The hope of water, symbolized by the few remaining pools, was increasingly covered by a thick, suffocating layer of red dust. Water was turning into a dusty mirror, reflecting only the town's desperate face. One afternoon, as Eli and Joe stood by the trickling creek bed, looking at the unnatural dryness, Joe felt the oilskin packet in her vest. She had to know. That night, after Eli and Mabel were asleep, Joe slipped out of her room. She carried a dim lantern and the old, faded survey map and sketch. She needed to verify the location of the Coyote Spring. She rode Tempest silently past Eli's sleeping ranch house, past the spot where the old creek trace should have been robust. She dismounted in the deep, shadowy woods at the northern boundary, the only part of the terrain that wasn't fully exposed to the dry wind. She held the lantern low and carefully compared the landmarks on the old sketch to the physical reality, a distinctive, split granite ridge, a cluster of lightning-struck oaks. The sketch, though crude, was accurate. The map showed the spring itself originated in a narrow, rocky fissure high up in the ridge, then flowed downhill to feed the main creek. But when Joe reached the fissure, she found something solid, new, and deeply concerning. The natural opening in the rock, where water should have been seeping or at least dripping, was tightly covered. It wasn't natural blockage. It was clearly the work of human hands. Large slabs of rock held in place by industrial-looking iron spikes, the kind of equipment used for rail construction. The water, Eli's rightful water, hadn't just dried up. It had been deliberately diverted or sealed off at its source, leading it directly away from the small ranches and likely toward Kincaid's new depot. Joe felt a surge of cold fury mixed with triumph. She had the map. She had the evidence. Her small victory, however, was immediately overshadowed by another cold wave of dread. Tucked under one of the newly placed slabs of stone, she found a rough, handwritten note. It wasn't a note for her. It was a note to Eli Cutter, delivered by Kincaid's lawyer, which she hadn't seen. The ultimatum was explicit, demanding that Eli sell before the creek was entirely depleted. Joe stood in the dark, the faint moonlight glinting off the iron spikes. She realized the danger was not just economic. This was calculated destruction. She had stumbled upon the heart of Kincaid's scheme. The revelation was her hook. The water was there, but it was being maliciously held ransom. And Joe, carrying the true, forgotten deed to the Coyote Spring, was about to enter the ring. Not just as Eli's temporary hand, but as the only person who might have the legal, if risky, means to fight back. Joe rode Tempest back to the ranch at a furious, controlled pace. The discovery of the iron-spiked barricade was not just evidence of Kincaid's dirty play. It was a personal affront. He wasn't merely exploiting the drought, he was engineering it. She didn't wait until morning. She found Eli in the barn, still awake, sorting through old harnesses, the soft glow of a lantern illuminating his strained expression. He looked tired, the kind of exhaustion that settled deep into the bone. "You're still up?" Eli noted, without looking up. "So are you—" "I know why your creek is dry," Jo said, her voice sharp and low. She walked straight to the point, pulling the small, fragile copy of the ultimatum letter from her pocket, the one she'd found tucked under the barricade rock. She didn't mention the map yet. Eli's head snapped up. His eyes, usually slow and deliberate, were suddenly fierce. "You went out there. I told you this is my fight." "It's not a fight, Eli. It's a robbery in broad daylight, and you're too damn stubborn to see how far they're willing to go," Jo retorted, tossing the note onto the workbench. "They haven't just diverted the water. They've blocked the Coyote Spring fissure completely. With railroad spikes and rock slabs, this note was under the rock. They want you to know they're doing it, and they want you to break." Eli picked up the note, his thumb rubbing furiously over the crisp paper. The sight of the barricade was proof of malice, and the note was the smoking gun. His shoulders stiffened. "You had no right to go spying on my boundary line," Eli stated, his voice a dangerous rumble. Jo stepped closer, her temper flaring. "You think I have time for your pride if I wait for permission? Mabel will be thirsty, and Kincaid will own your land, your horses, and everything you've sweated for. I'm here. I can shoot straight, and I can think faster than Deputy Bale. I'm no lady who waits for a man to give her permission to be useful." The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the scent of hay, leather, and unspoken electricity. Jo stood her ground, her body tense, waiting for the inevitable dismissal or accusation about her questionable history. Eli looked at her, truly looked at her. He saw the fire, the competence, and the absolute sincerity in her defense of his home. He saw a woman who knew her worth and demanded to be treated as an equal in danger. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. A slow, lazy smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth, the first hint of genuine, unburdened humor Jo had ever seen from him. "Good," Eli drawled, the single word cutting through the tension. "I ain't ever wanted one that polite. I want you wild." The words hung in the air, a profound and unexpected declaration. It was not a romantic compliment delivered in the moonlight, but a rough, sincere acceptance of her full, complicated nature. Eli wasn't asking her to soften. He was acknowledging that her strength, her defiance, and her willingness to bend the rules were exactly what they needed. It was an affirmation of partnership that transcended mere physical attraction, resonating with a deep, mutual respect. It was the moment their alliance solidified into something more. Jo felt the blood rush to her cheeks, a rare moment of surprise melting her defensive armor. She had braced herself for judgment, and instead, she received absolute endorsement. "Fine," Jo muttered, turning slightly to hide the flush. "But next time, you tell me where you're going." Eli nodded. "Next time, we go together. We're a team now, but we set boundaries. I respect your history, whatever it is, and I treat you like a partner. You promise me you won't pull a stunt that gets you killed, or me arrested for murder when I lose my temper defending you." "I promise not to go for a solo martyr play," Jo conceded. The unspoken promise was clear mutual defense and respect for the other's capacity for violence. They decided they couldn't simply tear down the barricade, that would be vandalism, and give Kincaid the legal upper hand. They needed proof that the barrier was industrial and illegal, a clear-cut case of corporate interference, not just a rock slide. The next day, under the deceptive heat of noon, they rode out together to the Coyote Fissure. Eli had his tools, a pickaxe and a few heavy crowbars. "We're not taking it down," Jo reminded him. "No, we're confirming the depth of the betrayal," Eli said grimly. They spent the afternoon scraping away the dry earth around the base of the rock slabs. The work was slow and silent, punctuated only by the scrape of metal against stone. Beneath the dirt, they confirmed the worst thick, forged iron spikes, clearly manufactured in a railroad yard. were driven deep into the bedrock to wedge the large stones and seal the natural spring. The sheer amount of effort involved proved that Kincaid was not relying on natural forces. This was a deliberate, expensive construction. As they worked, Joe used a small knife to carve a few distinct markings into the iron spikes, a secret signature they could use to prove later that the barrier had been inspected at this precise time. Suddenly, Joe felt a cool, damp sensation on her forearm. A thin line of water, slow but persistent, was weeping from a crack in the sealed stone, a result of the pressure their digging had released. Hope. It was the freshest, purest water Joe had tasted in weeks, a primal promise bubbling up from the earth. Joe knelt, letting the meager trickle run over her hands, washing the red mud away. Eli knelt beside her, watching the water. Then, without a word, his mud-caked hand reached out and covered Joe's. The contact was brief, powerful, and utterly devoid of pretense. Their hands, both scarred and smeared with the same gritty earth, briefly interlocked in the shadow of the man-made dam. The shared dirt, the cool wetness, and the simple human touch spoke volumes about their commitment to the land and to each other. "It's there," Eli breathed, the first hint of real, solid hope in his voice. "The spring is still strong, and Kincaid is holding it ransom." Joe finished, pulling her hand back reluctantly. The feeling of his strong, calloused palm remained. The legal and physical risk of removing the barricade was immense, especially with Deputy Bale always lurking. Bale had become a constant, uncomfortable presence in town, a silent shadow of Kincaid's surveillance. They knew the deputy would love nothing more than to catch Eli or Joe with a pickaxe near Kincaid's interests. Back at the ranch, the quiet tension dissolved into a moment of playful humor. Joe was inspecting one of Eli's older, grayer horses, a notoriously difficult gelding named Anchor. The horse had a perpetually sour expression and always tried to nip at Joe when she brushed him. "You know, Eli," Joe said, giving Anchor a skeptical look, "this horse is as moody as his owner. Stubborn, too. Won't take a direct path to the water trough if he can find a way to argue about it first." Eli, who was oiling a saddle nearby, didn't look up but chuckled a rare, deep sound that melted the sharpness of the dry air. "He's a good horse, just particular about who he lets get close." Joe raised an eyebrow, meeting Eli's brief, sharp glance. "And does he only choose the good ones?" "He does," Eli replied, his tone entirely serious. "He knows what's genuine." The conversation was light, but the underlying layers of meaning, trust, genuineness, and acceptance were thick and warm. But the light moments were quickly overshadowed by external threats. Joe had ridden into town to buy flour. As she was leaving Pearl's board and victuals, Pearl pulled her aside, her face set with worry. "Two men, strangers, hired the last rooms I have," Pearl whispered, leaning close. "They're not railroad men. Not exactly. More like hired muscle. They spent the better part of an hour asking Hobbs where Eli Cutter spends his afternoons, what time he usually comes back from the range, and what sort of help he hired." Pearl's eyes were frantic. "They know you're there. Joe, Kincaid isn't waiting for the 10 days to pass. He's going to make an accident happen." Joe tightened her grip on the flour sack. "Thank you. Pearl, keep your eyes open. And don't tell Eli you told me." Joe rushed back to the ranch, an acute sense of dread replacing the earlier warmth. She found Eli and Mabel finishing their dinner. They ate under the oppressive stillness of the high desert night. She tried to stay calm, but the air felt heavy, like a drawn breath before a crash. Joe walked to the barn, checking on Tempest and Anchor. Everything seemed normal. The hay was piled high and dry. Joe was leaving the main barn door when she heard a soft, scuffing noise near the south corner of the corral fence. It was too quiet to be natural, too deliberate. She crept into the darkness, drawing her revolver, the metallic coolness a sudden comfort. She heard a soft thud, and then the receding sound of hoofbeats, quickly swallowed by the wide, dusty land. She found it instantly a crude, oil-soaked rag tied to a burning wick, still sputtering, smoldering deep into the dry hay stacked against the wall of the main barn. A few more minutes, and the whole building, housing Eli's valuable horses and their winter feed, would have gone up in a roaring blaze. The deliberate, brutal act was a clear escalation, a direct attempt to bankrupt Eli and force him off the land immediately. Joe kicked the smoldering bundle away from the hay, grinding it into the dirt with the heel of her boot until the last wisp of smoke died. She stood there, breathing the acrid smell of burnt cloth and realizing the full gravity of Kincaid's threat. It was no longer about lawyers and ultimatums. It was about fire and violence. She walked back to the house, her face pale beneath the dust. Eli met her at the door, the revolver he kept above the mantel now firmly in his hand. He hadn't heard the retreating horse, but he had smelled the faint smoke. "What was it?" he asked, his voice flat with recognition. Someone tossed a fire starter at the hay. Joe showed him the extinguished, blackened rag. They missed the main pile and panicked when they heard me. Eli stared at the evidence, the dark, charred stain against the clean dirt. It was a new scar on their home, a direct challenge. Kincaid was sending a terrifying message. "We fight them with the law," Joe said firmly, though her hands were shaking. "We can't fight them with fire." "We might not have a choice," Eli replied, his eyes dark. He knew the fight was now physical and imminent. The smell of smoke lingered in the dry, still air. The attempt to burn them out was the final, terrifying hook, binding Joe and Eli together irrevocably, not just as working partners, but as defenders of a home that was now actively under siege. The close call with the fire starter left a dark, charred patch of ground near the barn, a visible, ugly scar on the ranch. It was a constant reminder of the darkness that now threatened their fragile peace. Eli and Joe worked in silence the next day, building a low stone wall around the haystack, a practical defense against future malice. They were prepared now, their vigilance sharpened, but the air felt heavy with impending confrontation. Nature, it seemed, was determined to add its own cruelty. Just before noon, a faint brown line appeared on the horizon. Within minutes, the wind shifted, and the sky turned a choking, angry yellow. A massive dust storm, a true test of survival in the high desert, was bearing down on Ash Hollow. "Get the horses to the ravine," Eli yelled over the sudden, violent roar of the wind, instinctively knowing the barn was no place for panic-stricken animals. Joe. Eli and Mabel worked frantically to herd the horses toward the sheltered, stony ground of a nearby gully. The wind was a physical antagonist, ripping at clothes and stinging the skin with fine sand. Visibility dropped to mere feet. Everything dissolved into a swirling, suffocating hell of red dust. They managed to push the bulk of the skittish herd into the ravine's lee side. Joe, counting heads in the gloom, realized Mabel was missing. "Mabel," Eli shouted, his voice hoarse, fighting the wind's deafening noise. "She was by the main fence," Joe cried, already turning back toward the ranch. Joe moved with a focused, almost blind determination. She knew the ranch layout, but the storm was disorientation incarnate. Then, she remembered a small, colorful piece of cloth Mabel had been wearing earlier, a brightly patterned scrap tied to her braid, which she often untied and played with. As Joe stumbled toward the fence line, her eyes scanning the ground, she saw it a small, dark shape clinging to a fence post. It was the handkerchief, tied hastily to a splintered rail. Mabel, instinctively following the lessons of her father and the trail-wise knowledge of the West, had left a small, defiant marker. Joe followed the line of the fence, finding another marker, then another, leading her away from the open field toward the small, sheltered storage shed they rarely used. Joe found Mabel huddled inside, terrified but safe, covering her mouth and nose with the hem of her shirt. Joe scooped the girl up, holding her tight against the wind's buffeting force. That was smart. Kid, real smart. "I got scared," Mabel whispered into Joe's shoulder. "Coughing dust." "Being scared is fine," Joe said, already heading toward the ravine. "It's running scared, that's the problem." They reached the shelter of the ravine just as the storm peaked, huddling with Eli and the horses until the wind gradually began to subside, leaving a world layered in thick, unsettling silence and an even deeper coating of red dust. The physical threat of the storm gave way to a social assault. The day after the dust settled, a copy of the weekly Ash Hollow Sentinel arrived at Pearl's board and victuals. The lead story, prominently featured, was titled Moral Decay in the Drought Gun-Toting Women and Endangered Youth. The article, clearly planted and paid for by Kincaid's interests, was a venomous piece of character assassination. It described Jo as a vagrant female of dubious history, armed and dangerous, who was setting a scandalous example for the town's children and corrupting young minds with tales of violence. The article focused relentlessly on the image of Jo with a gun, turning her bravery in the stagecoach ambush into a moral blight, painting her as a bad influence on Mabel. The article hit Jo harder than any physical attack. It targeted the core of her internal struggle, the desperate desire to forge an honest, respectable life, and the shame of her ambiguous past. She hated the feeling of being judged and categorized, especially when she was trying so hard to be decent. The confrontation came the following Sunday. Ash Hollow was small enough that attendance at Pastor Reeves's church was virtually mandatory for appearances. Jo attended, sitting near the back with Eli and Mabel. The moment they walked in, Jo felt the sharp, silent knives of the community's judgment. People turned, whispering behind gloved hands and hymn books. Mothers pulled their children closer. The condemnation was palpable, fueled by the newspaper's poison. Jo stood tall, meeting their gazes with a fierce resolve. She was no lady, but she was honest now, and she refused to shrink under their disapproval. Pastor Reeves began his sermon, choosing a careful, non-committal text about community support, but he was visibly uneasy. Glancing nervously at Jo and Eli, terrified of offending the powerful Kincaid, yet desperate to uphold the true Christian spirit, his sermon was lurching and lukewarm, avoiding the specific issue of moral judgment versus true courage. Just as the silence during the offertory became heavy with unspoken malice, a sharp voice cut across the room. "If any of you want to talk about moral decay," Pearl announced loudly. Standing up from her usual pew near the front, her arms crossed firmly over her large frame. "You look in the mirror before you look at the girl who saved one of your own children last week. That girl has dirt on her hands, but her conscience is clean. She saved your people, and you throw mud." Pearl's defense was unexpected and fierce, breaking the rigid, judgmental silence. It was a lifeline for Jo, a reminder that not all of the community was poisoned by Kincaid's money. Pearl then walked toward the back and stood deliberately beside Jo, a solid, defiant ally. The collective gasp in the church was deafening. The ultimate confrontation, however, was reserved for Eli. Later that week, Silas Kincaid arrived at the Cutter Ranch, not with lawyers this time, but alone, riding a massive, expensive chestnut horse. He dismounted, radiating false cordiality and confidence. "Eli," Kincaid greeted him, his smile fixed. "The 10 days are up. I told you this land would dry up, and it has. I'm here to finalize the transfer. I don't want to see good men ruined." He pulled a thick, tightly banded sheaf of currency from his inner coat pocket, a substantial amount of cash, more than Eli had seen in years. He placed it deliberately on the worn, scarred porch rail. "A signing bonus," Kincaid explained smoothly. "You can take this, pay off your debts, move Mabel to a safer, more respectable town, and find a job working the rail lines. It's a clean break. The alternative is ruin, foreclosure, and the loss of your reputation, not to mention the company you're keeping." His gaze drifted pointedly toward the barn, subtly emphasizing Jo's presence. Eli stood on the porch, his face impassive, his hands hanging loosely at his sides. The money was a real temptation, a way out of the suffocating debt, a guarantee of safety for Mabel, for a desperate moment. Eli felt the heavy burden of responsibility. The chilling fear of pulling Joe and Mabel into a danger he couldn't contain. The memory of the scorched earth near the haystack was fresh. If he stayed, he was risking everything and everyone he cared for. But then, the quiet dignity of Joe's struggle, her absolute refusal to surrender her worth to Kincaid's judgment, solidified his resolve. He wasn't just defending land. He was defending the right of people like Joe, people who choose to be honest, to build a safe place. Eli looked Kincaid straight in the eye, his own blue eyes cold and hard as granite. "Take your money." "Silas," Eli said, his voice slow and deliberate, "my honor isn't for sale, and neither is this land. If you want it, you'll have to fight me in court, or you'll have to dig it out of the ground when I'm dead." Kincaid's smile finally vanished. His eyes flashed with a brief, naked hatred. "You've made a terrible mistake. Eli, you're dragging your family into a fire. And you can't say I didn't warn you." He snatched the money from the rail, mounted his horse, and rode away, the dust he raised seeming to mock Eli's defiant stand. Eli watched him go, the weight of the decision pressing down on him, the fear of failure, the fear of losing the women he was starting to care for, warred with his stubborn resolve. He was holding onto his father's old belief, a man who keeps his water keeps his home, but Joe's influence was shifting his understanding. He was learning that keeping the people was the true meaning of keeping the home. Joe found him later, sitting on the porch, his head bent. She didn't offer sympathy. She offered distraction and shared purpose. "Come on," she said, her voice gentle. Mabel's practicing her aim. Out behind the henhouse, Joe was teaching Mabel how to handle a rifle safely, using the low fence railing as a rest. The target was a row of empty bean cans set on a post. Mabel was struggling, her young hands unsteady. She fired, and the bullet went wide, kicking up dust harmlessly 10 feet away from the cans. Mabel's face crumpled in frustration. "I missed," she wailed. Joe calmly reloaded the spent cartridge. "You made a noise, a loud, good noise. It's not good if it missed." "Look, kid," Joe said, crouching down. "Out here, sometimes the aim isn't the point. You fired. You spoke your piece. You told the world you're here and you won't stand for what you see. Sometimes, the fact that you spoke at all, even a little off the mark, is the whole thing. It's a presence. It's a voice." Eli stood watching, a faint smile touching his lips. Joe was teaching Mabel to fight back, not just with bullets, but with conviction. Their fragile hope, however, was quickly extinguished. Later that afternoon, Eli decided to walk the perimeter of the upper creek bed, checking for any signs of Kincaid's hired hands tampering with the natural flow further downstream. Joe was in the kitchen with Mabel when they heard the horses galloping back to the ranch anchor in the dark bay. Riderless, Joe and Mabel raced out. They found Eli a few hundred yards from the house. Near the edge of the creek trace, he was slumped against a rock outcropping, semi-conscious, a deep, bleeding wound above his temple where he'd been struck from behind. He had been ambushed, beaten, and left for dead. Joe immediately knelt, her practical skills kicking in. She checked his pulse, which was weak but steady. Mabel, terrified, held his hand, tears streaming. As Joe gently lifted Eli's shirt to check for broken ribs, she saw it jammed into the waistband of his trousers. Clearly meant to be discovered was a crudely fashioned iron spike, the kind used in railroad construction. It was stamped, almost branded, with a single, ominous letter, K. It was the final, brutal hook. Kincaid was done with talk and lawyers. He had delivered his last warning in blood. Eli's decision to stay had been met with a violent answer, and Joe knew they were now in a desperate fight for their lives, their land, and their family. Joe's hands, usually so steady holding a rifle, moved with a controlled urgency as she worked over Eli. She had dragged him into the house with Mabel's help and now had him settled on his cot. The oil lamp turned low. The blow to his head was serious, but there were no signs of a fractured skull, only a deep, ugly gash that bled freely. She cleaned the wound with whiskey and a clean strip of cotton torn from one of Eli's old shirts. Her brow furrowed in concentration. As she worked, Eli slowly began to regain consciousness, moaning softly. His hand reflexively going to his weapon, a motion Joe gently redirected. "It's Joe," she murmured. "You're home. They jumped you from behind. Cowards." When she finished stitching the cut and bandaging his head, she sat by his side, the silence broken only by Mabel's muffled sobs in the next room. Eli's eyes fluttered open, clear again, though filled with a burning, bitter rage. "Kincaid," he ground out, trying to push himself up. Joe placed a firm, restraining hand on his shoulder. "Stay put. You move. You open the stitches," Joe commanded. She picked up the iron spike marked with the K and placed it on the bedside table. "This is what they left you. A calling card. They want you dead or gone by sunrise." Eli stared at the spike, then at Joe. "We're out of time. We have to sell. Joe, I can't risk Mabel or you for a piece of dirt." "This isn't about dirt, Eli. It's about the truth," Joe said, her voice dropping to a low, intense whisper. This was the moment. She reached inside her vest, pulled out the oilskin packet, and carefully unfolded the brittle, yellowed land document and the crude sketch of the Coyote Spring. "You asked who I was, where I came from. I'm not just a writer from Kansas. I came here for this." She smoothed the old deed on the wooden table, the dim light casting shadows over the faded ink. The Coyote Spring, the one they've blocked the land it sits on, was originally deeded to Isabel Mallory. My mother, she was a laundress who came west 20 years ago. She had this tiny claim up in the ridge, near where the water naturally runs out of the rock. But she was poor. She couldn't read well, and she certainly couldn't afford a lawyer to fight the big interests back then. They called the land title lost. They ran her out, maybe worse. She died a few years later, never getting her land back. Eli listened, his pain forgotten for a moment, his eyes wide with comprehension. "Isabel Mallory was my mother, Eli, and I have the original deed. It's old, it's probably messy, but it names her, and the land survey matches the location of the spring your spring." This was the first twist, the moment the personal and the environmental conflicts became irrevocably linked. Joe was not a stranger merely helping a rancher. She was the rightful, though forgotten, heir to the very water Kincaid was stealing. "If this deed is proven valid," Joe explained, tracing the rough outline of the spring on the sketch, "the spring and the surrounding rock belong to me. And if it belongs to me, Kincaid is illegally barricading the water that flows from my land onto yours." Eli grasped the immense legal and moral gravity of the situation. "You're the rightful owner of the headwaters. That means we can break the barrier and claim the water without it being vandalism. We hit him legally." "Yes," Joe confirmed, but then her expression tightened, reflecting the moral dilemma. "But here's the truth. Eli, if I file this deed, the court might recognize my full ownership of the spring water. If I take it all, you'll be saved. But the rest of Ash Hollow, the folks downstream who sided with Kincaid or just stayed silent, they'll all dry up. My mother lost her land to greed, and I won't take it back with the same selfishness." This was the ethical crossroad, the love story, the redemption arc, and the fight for justice all converged here. Joe had the right to claim the water exclusively, but that would violate the principle of justice. She was fighting for the notion that water was life and should be shared. "Water is life," Eli whispered, echoing the unsaid philosophy of the West. He looked at the spike, then at Joe's determined face. "We don't fight a monster by becoming one. We open the water, we save the land, then we go to court and propose a fair agreement, a shared water right for the community, established legally. We use your ownership to break Kincaid, not to steal from our neighbors." They made their pact over the wounded man's cot, a promise made not with flowery words, but with a shared commitment to a greater, fairer good. Their immediate decision was reckless but necessary. Open the water now to save the crops and the community's hope. And then face the legal and physical consequences. Jo acted quickly. She rode to Pearl's, her demeanor calm but urgent. She told Pearl only the immediate necessity. They had proof Kincaid illegally blocked the water and they needed strong hands and discretion to open it tonight. Pearl, a woman who understood the language of survival, was in immediately. "I'll get Hobbs," she said, her eyes flashing with righteous fury. He's been waiting for an excuse to use his sledgehammer on something other than horseshoes. By the dark hours before dawn, a small, conspiratorial team assembled near the high, dry ridge jumper. Eli supported and moving with painful caution. The massive blacksmith Hobbs, Pearl, and even Mabel, who refused to stay behind and insisted on being the lookout. The plan was simple. Hobbs would use his sheer strength to lever the heavy stones and spike barricade. Jo would cover them from a distance, and Eli would guide the effort. They worked in tense, absolute silence under the cold, watchful eye of the moon. Hobbs grunted with effort, his muscles straining against the industrial iron and rock. Jo stood guard, her heart hammering against her ribs, her gaze sweeping the horizon for any sign of Deputy Bale or Kincaid's men. Finally, with a grating, tearing sound of metal protesting stone, the barrier broke free. Hobbs stepped back just as a low, gurgling sound began to emanate from the fissure. At first, it was just a whisper. Then, the sound intensified, growing into a steady, triumphant rush. Water, cool and dark, surged out of the rocky fissure, rushing down the narrow, forgotten trace and into the dry creek bed. It flowed over the parched earth like a breath returning to a frozen lung. The water caught the moonlight, running silver and black, a symbol of instant, dramatic resurrection. Just as the water reached the creek bed, bubbling with life, a voice cut through the stillness. "Hold it right there. You're all under arrest." Deputy Bale, along with two of Kincaid's hired, heavily armed men, emerged from the surrounding scrub, their lanterns bobbing. They had been waiting, expecting Eli to come after the beating. Panic seized the group. Hobbs instinctively reached for the crowbar. Jo stepped forward, raising her hands to show she wasn't reaching for her gun. Before Bale could act, Pearl strode directly toward the deputy, her face a picture of righteous indignation. "Arrest us for what?" Bale clearing garbage, Pearl demanded, positioning herself strategically between Bale and the broken barrier. "We're clearing the debris. Look, we had to—" Mabel here was playing, and she almost fell into that filthy trench Kincaid's men dug. "We were clearing the loose rocks so the child wouldn't hurt herself. You want to arrest a woman for saving a child from falling into a ditch full of rocks?" Pearl's improvisation was brilliant. She used the community's high regard for protecting children and Bale's own cowardice to stall Bale, completely thrown by the accusation and the absurdity of arresting a grandmotherly figure for clearing debris to protect a girl. Hesitated, his authority wavering. The two hired thugs looked confused, their mission of catching the culprits red-handed suddenly undercut by the spectacle of an angry Pearl protecting Mabel. "I saw you tampering with the flow," Bale stammered. "We saw the flow tampered with," already Hobbs roared, leveraging his size and intimidating presence. "The good Lord's water has been stopped up by Kincaid's iron junk." The exchange gave Jo the precious minutes she needed. While Bale was sputtering and trying to save face with Pearl, Jo helped Eli, his jaw clenched against the pain, take a few slow steps toward the stream. Eli stood on the bank, watching the water flow, his face etched with exhaustion and profound relief. "Thank you, Jo," Eli whispered, looking at the restored creek, then at her. "You saved my home." Jo watched the water, but her eyes were fixed on his. She didn't smile, but her heart swelled with a sense of rightness she hadn't felt in years. She looked at the creek, the land, Mabel, Eli, and the distant, struggling town. "Our home, Eli," Jo replied, the word us appearing for the first time, a simple, solid brick laid in the foundation of their future. The water was flowing again, A small victory, a midpoint triumph. Joe and Eli returned to the ranch with the others, exhausted but exhilarated. They had won a small battle. But the victory was instantly met with retaliation. As the first rays of dawn painted the sky a bruised purple, a messenger from the telegraph office rode hard into the ranch yard, bearing an urgent dispatch. Kincaid had acted. He had filed an immediate, aggressive lawsuit against Eli Cutter and his accomplices for criminal trespass, destruction of property, and illegal water diversion. Kincaid had also hired 3 notorious, hard-looking gunmen from the rail camps, visible figures in the town. Their presence alone a silent menace to protect his remaining interests and intimidate the community. The water was flowing, but the fight had just begun. The town was now openly and definitively split, those who depended on Kincaid and those who dared to stand with Eli and the mysterious, gun-toting woman who carried the secret of the Coyote Spring. The courthouse, not the creek, was the next battleground. The courtroom in Ash Hollow was little more than a large, dusty room in the town hall, smelling faintly of coal smoke and old leather. But on the day of the emergency hearing, it was the focal point of the community, where every local feud and moral compromise was laid bare. Kincaid's lawyer, a slick man in a silk vest imported from the East, presented their case first. He argued aggressively, claiming that Eli Cutter and his associates had committed deliberate property damage by destroying a temporary water diversion structure built on Kincaid's leased land for public good. He presented a new map, clean and professionally drawn, which conveniently showed the Coyote Spring headwaters falling well within the perimeter of Kincaid Cattle and Rail's recently acquired rail corridor. The map was compelling, modern, and utterly false. Eli, still moving stiffly from the beating and wearing a fresh white bandage on his head, stood before the justice of the peace. He didn't have a lawyer. He had Joe. When it was their turn, Joe stepped forward. She was dressed in her cleanest denim, her expression unwavering. Eli stood directly beside her, not speaking, but his large hand rested lightly on the back of Joe's chair, a silent, powerful anchor of support. She felt the pressure of his presence, the acknowledgement that her fight was his fight, and she drew strength from it. Joe did not try to match the lawyer's rhetoric. She spoke with the raw, simple sincerity that came from living closer to the truth than to the law books. "Your Honor," Joe began, her voice steady, "the map Kincaid presents is a lie. The land was stolen once, and he is trying to steal it again." She unrolled the brittle, faded original land registry document, the deed to Isabel Mallory's original plot, and laid it out on the table next to Kincaid's pristine drawing. "This is the original survey," Joe declared. "It proves the headwaters of the Coyote Spring were established years ago as belonging to Isabel Mallory, my mother. And if it was hers, it is now mine. Kincaid's structure was not on his property. It was on my rightful inheritance, and he illegally dammed a natural water source that feeds the entire valley." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. The revelation of Joe's legitimate claim to the headwaters was a shock. The quiet woman who came in dusty clothes was suddenly the central legal figure. To bolster the ancient deed, Joe called her witness. "I ask leave to present the testimony of Mr. Running Bear," Joe requested. Eli and Hobbs ushered in an elderly Shoshone man, Running Bear, who lived quietly on the outskirts of Ash Hollow, a man respected for his age and his deep knowledge of the land, though rarely consulted by the white settlers. Joe approached Running Bear respectfully. She knew the testimony of an indigenous man might hold little weight with the court, but it held immense weight with the community's conscience. Before asking him to speak, Joe looked at him directly, not at the judge. "Sir," she said gently, "I have this old paper that says the land is mine, but you know the truth of the water. Will you share it with the court, so we can stop this man Kincaid from ruining the land?" Running Bear, standing tall despite his age, gazed slowly around the room, taking in the greed and the desperation. He agreed to speak, but with a condition that echoed the wisdom of the earth. He pointed a gnarled finger at the spot on Joe's old map. "The water comes from the sacred rock. That place is a gift. The pale woman Isabel, she knew this. She did not drink alone. The water must be shared by the seasons. The spring is life. It is not money to be hoarded." Joe nodded immediately, accepting the condition publicly. "If the court grants me the rightful title to the spring, I will formally dedicate the water to be shared with all legal homesteaders according to seasonal need, just as Mr. Running Bear dictates." The moment was electric. Joe was deliberately choosing ethical distribution over private profit, using her legal leverage to enforce public good. The community in the courtroom was immediately divided. A handful of smaller, honest farmers cheered quietly, grateful for the restored water and Joe's fair promise. But others, particularly the merchants and the handful of homesteaders who had secretly taken money from Kincaid or hoped to gain by his monopoly, hissed and muttered. They wanted Kincaid to win, hoping to ride the coattails of his rail boom, even if it meant sacrificing their neighbors. Kincaid himself, who had been observing from the back, now strode forward, his calm demeanor finally cracking. He leaned close to Eli and Joe, his voice a low, vicious snarl only they could hear. "You're playing a dangerous game, Cutter," Kincaid hissed. "You may have your legal claim today, but this won't stop. The railroad is coming. If you don't take my offer and walk away, I guarantees you and your little gun-toting helpmate will suffer an accident. I assure you, my insurance policies cover a lot more than fires now." The threat was clear. The violence would continue and escalate until they either sold the land or were eliminated. Joe felt a flicker of fear, but it hardened instantly into cold resolve. She looked at the man who threatened her life, thinking of the symbolic image of the cottonwood tree outside the courthouse rough, gnarled bark protecting a soft, white core. To survive in the West, you needed to be both hard and tender. She needed to be hard for the fight, but tender for the people she was protecting. "Your Honor," Joe said, deliberately raising her voice so the entire room could hear, "we rest our case on the legal claim of the deed and the moral weight of the water flowing today. Kincaid is a threat to this community's survival." The judge, cowed by Kincaid's power but moved by the physical presence of the restored water and Running Bear's moral testimony, decided he could not grant Kincaid the immediate restraining order or the damages he sought. The judge ruled that Joe's claim was strong enough to warrant a full, formal investigation, and that, until a final decision was reached, the water must be allowed to flow freely. It was a small, crucial victory, a respite from the law. As the crowd dispersed, Pearl approached Joe, her eyes sparkling with pride and a touch of mischief. "You sure told him." "Honey, but next time you want to deck that weasel, you wait until you get him behind my kitchen. Don't do it in public." Joe managed a tight, grateful smile. Noted, Pearl, save the theatricals for the private show. The small moment of shared humor was a necessary pressure release. But the rest of the day was filled with a heavy silence, an oppressive quiet that felt more menacing than the earlier courtroom shouting. Everyone knew Kincaid would retaliate with brutal force. The silence was the sound of the hurricane approaching. Back at the ranch, Eli stood guard by the door, his eyes scanning the ridgeline. The anxiety was a physical weight. "He won't stop," Eli stated, not needing to name Kincaid. "He'll send those gunslingers here tonight." Joe was cleaning her revolver, methodically checking each chamber. "Then we'll be ready. We stand here. We don't run." Eli came and stood behind her, his large frame a reassuring barrier. He didn't touch her, but the closeness was an intimacy in itself. "I won't let him hurt you." "Joe!" Eli vowed, his voice low and fierce. "I know," Joe said simply, "and I won't let him hurt us." They were bound together by shared purpose, shared danger, and a deepening, unspoken love built on mutual competence and defiance. They were home, but home was a battlefield. As the sun dipped below the wide Wyoming sky, casting long, menacing shadows across the dry slopes, a sudden, piercing shriek cut through the quiet. It was Mabel. Joe and Eli raced out to the yard. Mabel was gone. Her favorite leather doll lay dropped near the gate, pinned to the wooden gate post. In the exact spot where Mabel's handkerchief had been left during the dust storm was a crude piece of cured cowhide, scratched deeply into the center of the hide. Unmistakable and chilling was the letter K. It was a cold, deliberate declaration of war. Kincaid had taken their child. The moment Joe saw the cowhide with the bold, chilling letter K, the fear for Mabel turned into ice-cold purpose. Kincaid had gone past property and money. He had crossed the unforgivable line of family. He'll take her to his main storage area, near the rail line, Joe deduced instantly, her mind racing through the options. It's isolated and perfect for forcing a negotiation. Eli, his eyes blazing with a dangerous, unrestrained fury that Joe had never witnessed, was already grabbing his rifle. I'm going in. He wants me to sign. I'll sign. I'll give him the land. Then I'll take Mabel back. No, Joe said, her hand clamping down hard on his arm. The intensity in her voice was absolute. Eli, listen to me. If you sign, he gets everything, and he still might kill Mabel or let her go just to watch you starve. You sign today. They swallow the whole town tomorrow. We don't sacrifice the future for the immediate fix. We go in, but we go in to win the war, not to surrender the battle. Eli hesitated, his breath catching in his throat, torn between the desperate instinct to protect his kin and the brutal logic of Joe's warning. Joe's eyes held him, steady and demanding. He nodded, the fury subsiding just enough to allow strategy to take hold. Joe took a moment to study the tracks. Mabel's small. Distinct boot prints were visible, mixed with the scuff marks of a wider horseshoe and the shallow drag mark of a rope with burrs, Joe noted. The kind often used at the Kincaid camp for rough-breaking horses. It's the old supply depot, Joe confirmed. I remember seeing it on the way in. Isolated sheds, heavy on oil and lumber. Eli moved quickly to the barn. He couldn't fight Kincaid's gunmen alone. He was wounded and outnumbered. He saddled the dark bay and rode hard, not toward the depot, but into town. He rallied the two men he knew he could trust completely, Hobbs, the blacksmith, whose strength was legendary, and a quiet homesteader named Sam, a man of fierce loyalty. Meanwhile, Joe did the one thing she knew would ensure some level of outside assistance. She rode back to Pearl's board and victuals. Pearl, already knowing the severity of the situation, didn't waste a single question. I need you to get to the telegraph office, Joe instructed quickly, her voice tight. Send a dispatch to the territorial marshal. Tell them Silas Kincaid is holding a minor child hostage at his supply depot near the new rail line, and that he is threatening murder and arson to force a land transfer. Make it official. Get them moving. Pearl grabbed her shawl. Go! Save the girl! I'll make sure the law knows where to find the evidence. Joe rode Tempest back toward the outskirts. She met Eli, Hobbs, and Sam near the edge of the Kincaid property, a wide area dominated by rough storage sheds, piles of freshly cut lumber, and an old, rickety shack used for storing combustibles. Joe quickly laid out her plan. The depot is surrounded by scrub and dry grass. Kincaid is going to use fire to smoke us out, or to force Eli's hand. We have two advantages: the water we opened, and the fact that we know where the main fire hazards are. Joe dismounted. I'm going high. There is a drainage ditch that runs off the roof of that main shed. I can use it to create a distraction. Eli, you and Hobbs create a loud diversion at the main gate. Sam, you stay back, watch the lines of retreat, and keep cover. Eli argued. You can't go alone. I'm faster and quieter, Joe insisted, checking her revolver. I'm also the only one who can hit a moving target in the dark. Trust me, partner. Eli, recognizing the tactical superiority of her plan, swallowed his protest. Be careful. Bring her back safe. Joe melted into the darkness, moving like a shadow through the dry brush, making her way toward the highest point of Kincaid's rickety depot structure. Inside the shack, Mabel was huddled in a corner, terrified but quiet. Her small body curled next to a stack of burlap sacks. The air was thick with the smell of lamp oil. Kincaid stood over her, his 3 hired guns, the men who had been intimidating the town, standing ready outside. Kincaid held a crude, homemade torch, its flame spitting and smoking. "Now, Eli Cutter will sign the paper." "Child," Kincaid murmured, his voice chillingly calm, "or we will have a very big, very hot accident here." Just then, one of Kincaid's men rolled a lit wagon wheel tire, soaked in kerosene, toward the corner of the shed. The tire rolled close, setting a small pile of loose wood scrap alight. The fire started small, a hungry, yellow tongue licking at the dry walls. Outside, Eli and Hobbs executed their plan. They exploded through the front gate, Eli shouting Kincaid's name, Hobbs bringing his huge hammer down on the main wooden post, splintering it and drawing all the attention of the gunmen. As the hired guns focused on the front, Jo made her move. She climbed onto the roof of the shed, pulling herself up silently. She found the wooden gutter, the water channel that Kincaid had installed to collect the infrequent rain, and directed into a holding tank. She didn't have much time. The fire was growing, the smoke now billowing out of the small window near Mabel. Jo saw the heavy tank full of water Kincaid had set up for his own use. She used the crowbar she carried, not for digging, but for leverage. She jammed the bar into the side of the wooden holding tank, just above the gutter, and pulled with all her strength. The tank, already weakened, splintered violently. A sudden, unexpected torrent of water, the stored, hoarded water, gushed out of the broken tank and cascaded directly down the roof gutter. Jo directed the flow with her foot, aiming it precisely toward the raging fire that was starting to consume the shed where Mabel was held. The sound of the rushing water was thunderous, a sudden, artificial rainstorm in the heart of the dry, hostile night. The water struck the fire with a tremendous hiss and a cloud of steam, quenching the flames immediately. The fire was out, but the commotion was deafening. Kincaid, enraged by the sudden intervention and the loss of his leverage, turned on Mabel, pulling her roughly to her feet. "You little devil!" he roared, then shoved her toward the back door of the shack, aiming to use her as a human shield against the men outside. As Eli, seeing the fire quenched, rushed the main entrance, Kincaid stumbled out the back, his arms wrapped around Mabel. He saw Jo dropping down from the roof. Kincaid drew his revolver and leveled it straight at Jo's chest. "You should have left well enough alone, little lady." Eli lunged forward, moving with a desperate, painful speed. Throwing himself between Kincaid and Jo, he wouldn't allow her to take the bullet. In that frozen moment, the silence was shattered by a deafening gunshot. But the bullet did not come from Kincaid's gun, nor Jo's. Kincaid dropped his weapon and slumped, grasping his arm. The shot had hit him squarely in the shoulder. Deputy Bale stood on the perimeter, his pistol smoking. It was the second, stunning twist of the night. Bale had fired the saving shot. Bale didn't shoot out of heroism. He shot because he saw Kincaid, enraged and cornered, pointing a gun at a federal witness, Eli, and a child, Mabel, with the territorial marshal's name suddenly linked to the situation via Pearl's telegraph. Bale knew Kincaid would blame him next, silencing him forever. Bale had fired his shot not to save the community, but to save his own miserable skin, ensuring he was the one who delivered the final, crippling blow. The 3 hired gunmen, seeing their leader shot and the depot now a scene of chaos, scattered into the darkness. Hobbs, rushing the yard, quickly subdued the wounded Kincaid. Eli, momentarily stunned but physically intact, spun around and disarmed Deputy Bale, pinning the frantic man to the ground. "He was going to kill me," Bale screamed, scrambling. "He was going to kill us all." Jo, moving with the practiced efficiency of a woman who knew how to finish a job, pulled the iron handcuffs from the deputy's own belt. She locked Kincaid, bleeding and defeated, and Bale, whimpering and desperate, together. "You both go to the marshal together," Jo declared, her eyes hard. You can argue over who's the bigger rat on the way. Eli, his body finally allowing itself to register the shock, stumbled back toward Mabel. He pulled her into a fierce, shaking embrace, burying his face in her hair, checking her body for any sign of harm. He held her so tight she could barely breathe, the relief of physical agony. He released her, his eyes dry, too numb to cry, his whole body trembling violently. Jo walked over, her own fear finally receding. She placed a steadying hand on the back of his neck, her fingers finding the pulse in his tense, rigid skin. "You're shaking, Eli," she murmured, her voice rough. "I was too late," he choked out. "I should have just signed. I almost lost her." Jo held his gaze. "But you didn't. You're alive. She's alive. You're breathing and you're standing. That's the only measure we use. Eli, you're breathing. We're standing." The climax had passed. The artificial rain from Kincaid's broken reservoir slowly mixed with the red dust of the battlefield, washing away the evidence of the violent night. Fire and water had clashed, and water had won, but only through a terrible, tense ordeal. In the distance, a long, lonely whistle sounded the sound of the coming train, the symbol of the future that was inevitable. The railroad was still coming to Ash Hollow, but tonight it had lost its architect of greed. Kincaid, defeated and disgraced, was leaving, bound for the authority of the territorial marshals. The physical threat was gone, replaced by the aftermath of justice. The fight was over, and they had won together. The arrival of the territorial marshals was swift and conclusive. Riding in on the dusty morning light, they found the wreckage of Kincaid's ambitions, a shattered water tank, a spent fire, and Kincaid and Deputy Bale, still handcuffed together, trading accusations and fear. The marshals took immediate statements from Eli, Jo, Hobbs, and Peril. Kincaid, wounded and ranting, and Bale, whining about self-defense, were quickly loaded onto a wagon and sent toward the nearest official jail. The marshals secured Kincaid's empty rail office and commenced a thorough search. The search quickly uncovered Kincaid's black book, a ledger detailing every bribe paid, every threat made, and every local official, including several town council members who had accepted money to vote in favor of his water diversion schemes. Kincaid's financial empire in Ash Hollow collapsed not with a bang, but with the quiet, damning discovery of his own meticulously kept records. The era of economic oppression in Ash Hollow had officially ended with the sweep of a marshal's hand. The legal battle over the water, however, was still critical. A preliminary court session was hastily convened to settle the immediate, pressing issue of the water rights before the entire community could descend into chaos. Jo stood before the justice of the peace again, not as a witness, but as the plaintiff and the primary land claimant. Her original deed to the Coyote Spring was authenticated, giving her legitimate ownership of the crucial headwaters. But Jo had already made her moral decision. She addressed the court, her voice calm and firm, looking not at the judge, but at the assembled townsfolk. "I claim this land and the water that flows through it," Jo stated. "It was stolen from my mother, Isabel Mallory, and I reclaim it in her name. But the water is too vital to be owned by one person. I formally accept the condition laid out by Mr. Running Bear." She presented a simple, signed document, an official agreement dedicating the flow from the Coyote Spring to be shared among all legitimate homesteaders in the valley, with usage regulated based on seasonal need and guided by the advice of the oldest residents who understood the cycles of the land. The court, relieved to find an equitable solution, swiftly granted Jo the legal title to the spring, with the covenant that the water would always be shared with the community. Jo Mallory, the woman dismissed as a gun-toting stranger, was now the legal guardian of the town's most precious resource. She had achieved not just personal redemption, but public justice. The reaction of the community was immediate and humbling. People who had whispered behind their hands in the church now came to the ranch, sheepishly offering apologies and thanks. The small farmers whose wells were already starting to refill were openly grateful. Pearl organized a celebration, a rough-and-ready feast held in her yard. She prepared a massive pot of hearty stew, inviting everyone who had helped Eli, Joe, Mabel, Hobbs, and even Pastor Reeves, who had finally found the courage to stand firm against the remnants of Kincaid's influence. It was a feast of reconciliation, a simple acknowledgement that they had all been saved by courage and honesty. In the quiet aftermath, Eli spent hours working on his fences, trying to find a rhythm to settle his rattled nerves. The weight of his own internal conflict had been lifted, but the memory of his near surrender remained a scar. Joe found him by the corral, replacing a broken rail. "You're still punishing yourself," Joe observed quietly, leaning against the dusty fence post. Eli stopped hammering, resting the tool on the post. "I was ready to give in. Joe, I was ready to sign that paper. I thought keeping my dignity meant keeping the land, no matter the cost. But when Mabel was gone, I realized my father's words were wrong. Keeping the land is nothing. Keeping the people is what keeps the home. I risked you both, trying to win an honorable fight that was rigged to begin with." "But you didn't give in," Joe countered softly. "You let me stop you. You let Hobbs fight. You let Pearl send the wire. You learned to ask for help. Eli, that's not weakness. That's building something bigger than yourself." Joe, who had walked into Ash Hollow with the shame of her past wrapped around her like a shroud, finally felt the heavy mantle lift. She wasn't just a survivor anymore. She was a builder. She was no longer the anonymous writer. She was the one who held the water. She had matured from an aimless fugitive to a resolute community anchor, placing the common good above personal gain. She walked back toward the house. Before she reached the porch, she stopped by the old hand-dug well, which had been nearly dry for weeks. She looked at the small, rough wooden sign she had found nailed there when she first arrived, declaring the well empty. She pulled it down and tossed it into the nearest barrel. She retrieved a clean, fresh piece of wood and quickly carved a single word into it: shared. She hung the new sign where the old one had been, a tangible symbol of their victory. The day was fading into a deep, velvety twilight, heavy with the scent of damp earth after a small rain shower. Eli followed Joe onto the porch, the air between them thick with unspoken emotion. He took Joe's hands in his, covering them completely. Her hands were still rough and dirt-stained from the day's work, but they were the hands that had brought life back to his ranch. He didn't speak immediately. He simply looked at her, his blue eyes holding a profound gratitude that transcended mere words. He slowly raised her hands to his lips and kissed them, a long, deliberate press of his mouth against her skin. Then he let go of her hands, drawing her toward him. He bent his head and kissed Joe, a deep, slow, unhurried kiss that tasted of the clean air and the victory they had shared. It was a kiss that contained all the honesty, all the trust, and all the quiet commitment they had built in the heat, the dust, and the danger. It was not a kiss of passion, but a covenant. Eli pulled back, still holding her close. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, tarnished silver ring, simple and worn smooth with age. "This was my mother's," Eli said, his voice husky. "I thought I only needed this land to build a life. I was wrong. I don't need the land. I need the person who helps me keep what's real. You came in here and saved my home. Joe, you saved my family. I want to say this every day for the rest of my life." He looked directly into her eyes. "June Mallory, will you marry me? Will you make us official?" Joe's eyes were glistening, but her voice was steady, perfectly reflecting the woman he had asked to be his partner. "I won't promise to be a lady." "Eli," Joe said, her lip twitching into a familiar, wry smile. "I promise to keep the water flowing, keep our home safe, and keep you standing straight and honest. Yes, I'll marry you." They stood there for a long time, embracing under the stars, the sound of the gently flowing creek a soft lullaby in the background. The wedding would not be a fancy affair with silks and flowers. It would be a celebration built on the very foundation they had fought for. The date was set for the following week, coinciding with the community's traditional first water gathering. The wedding would be the first water ritual itself, shared with the entire valley. The immediate crisis was over. The battle won. The railroad was still coming, a promise of new people and new change. But Joe and Eli would face it standing on solid ground. The only things left to do were to formalize the union and celebrate the hard-won peace. The ceremony wasn't held in a church. It took place near the creek bed, where the tall, dry cattails were now showing faint signs of renewed green at their bases. The setting was intentionally simple, a rough wooden arch Eli had built, draped with the tough, silver-green leaves of the prairie sage. This was the first water gathering, a celebration of the stream's life, and Joe and Eli's wedding was woven into its fabric. The entire community of Ash Hollow showed up, dressed in their best, dust-worn Sunday clothes. Even Pastor Reeves was there, standing with the quiet dignity of a man who had finally chosen integrity over fear. The centerpiece of the gathering was the water. Near the Coyote Spring Trace, the water flowed strong and clear, the source now visible and protected. A row of large, unglazed clay storage pots chums waited patiently, each representing a different section of the valley. The ceremony began not with vows, but with a ritual of commitment to the land and to each other. Running Bear, standing slightly apart, offered a blessing in the Shoshone language, his hands raised to the sky, acknowledging the gift of water. Then, Joe, Eli, and Mabel stepped forward. Joe held a large, carved wooden ladle, and Eli held the authenticated deed to the spring, now framed and protected, with the official community water covenant inscribed directly below Joe's name. The core of the ritual was the sharing, one by one. Eli and Joe ladled the pure, cold water from the spring into the first clay chum, carefully ensuring the flow was equal. This was repeated for every pot, symbolizing the commitment to fair distribution. "No man owns the running water," Joe declared, her voice ringing clear over the hushed crowd, echoing Running Bear's wisdom. "We are only keepers, and we are sworn to share equally." Eli read the covenant aloud, proclaiming the water legally bound to the community for shared use, ensuring that Kincaid's greed could never hold it ransom again. Mabel, standing between her two guardians, had insisted on contributing. She stepped up, holding a piece of paper, her face serious. She read the short passage she had labored over, her voice trembling slightly with pride. Home is not just wood and nails. Home is where the water and the people flow together. And if they flow true, nobody can stop them. Pearl, standing next to them, wiped a tear with her apron, serving as Joe's proud, if unofficial, maid of honor. Hobbs, scrubbed clean and wearing a stiff, ill-fitting coat, stood awkwardly as Eli's best man. The family was not built by blood or tradition, but by fierce, loyal choice. Finally, Pastor Reeves asked for the vows. They were not the grand, poetic phrases of a chapel wedding, but promises forged in the fire of shared survival. Eli looked at Joe, the worn silver ring ready in his hand. "June Mallory, I promise to keep the water flowing true, and to keep my word to this community, I promise to keep us standing." Joe took the ring, placing it on her finger, the silver catching the sun. Simple and strong. She looked back at Eli, her eyes holding the history they had endured. "Eli Cutter, I promise to keep our people safe, to keep our home standing, and to keep you straight, even when the wind blows hard." The kiss they exchanged was slow and profound, a raw, sincere sealing of the covenant. As the ceremony concluded, the celebration broke out. The tension of the past weeks dissolved into laughter and noise. Children, released from the solemnity of the ritual, immediately began playing in the fresh overflow from the spring, splashing and shouting with joy. Mud, thick and newly wet, began to spatter their shoes and clothes. Joe, watching a group of boys and girls tracking mud across her boots, simply laughed, shaking her head. Eli, standing next to her, watched the scene unfold, the noise, the mess, the pure, unadulterated happiness that water brought to a thirsty land. He looked at Joe, her face streaked with a mixture of sweat, tears, and a faint smudge of mud. Her defiant, capable beauty radiating. "See there, Joe," Eli said, his voice deep with affection. "Mud on your boots, right on your wedding day. You certainly haven't learned to be a lady yet." Joe shrugged, a familiar, wry smile gracing her lips. "I'm no lady." Eli reached out, his finger gently wiping the mud from her cheek, his eyes full of the acceptance he had declared that tense night in the barn. Good. The moment was a warm echo of their first shared truth, a simple, perfect harmony that closed their long, tumultuous journey. The lesson of Ash Hollow was etched deep into the fabric of the community. Justice was not won by lofty words or clean hands, but by the shared, gritty labor of the honest. Love was not a fancy dress or a polite conversation, but the deliberate, daily choice to stand side by side, hands covered in mud, defending the sanctity of home and the principle of shared life. As the people slowly dispersed, the evening settling in, Joe, Eli, and Mabel stood on the porch of the ranch house. The ranch was no longer just Eli's struggling property. It was the symbolic heart of the community's triumph. Before the porch, hammered into the ground on a sturdy wooden post, stood a new sign. Joe had finished painting it earlier that day. The letters, simple and bold, "Coyote Spring Water Shared Here." In the distance, the faint, persistent rumble of the approaching railroad track was a reminder that the world was changing. New people would come, new challenges would rise, and the need for vigilance would never cease. But Joe, Eli, and Mabel stood together, the three of them silhouetted against the deepening Wyoming twilight. They had faced down economic tyranny, violence, and their own pasts. They had water, they had each other, and they were no longer afraid. The fight had built them into a family, resilient and ready for whatever the West could throw at them. Thank you for listening to our story. Please let us know in the comments where you are listening from, so we can all connect and share our thoughts on the courage of Joe and Eli. If you enjoyed this journey into the Wild West, please subscribe to the Wild West Tales channel, like the video, and press the hype button to help this story reach more people.